the 1990s when she worked on police and military reform as part of the Presidential Commission on State Reform in the Dominican Republic. Since then, she has been a vocal advocate for reforming the security sector in the Dominican Republic and ensuring civilian control over the military. In 2000, she organized ProCivil through Flaxo, through the Facultad de Ciencias Sociales in Latin America in the Dominican Republic, which sponsored civil-military dialogue between civil-military dialogue. In 2004, Dr. Bobia joined a team of specialists working on a reform program in the Dominican Republic called the Plan Democrático de Seguridad. In 2011, Dr. Bobia had a fellowship from the Social Science Research Council from the Drug Security and Democracy Program. In 2015, Dr. Bobia developed and implemented the Central American and Caribbean Platform for Citizen Security, a virtual educational research initiative funded by the Canadian government to form civilian specialists from El Salvador, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic on public security matters. Yanilda Maria Gonzalez is an assistant professor at the public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship in democracy, examining how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. Gonzalez's forthcoming book, Authoritarian Police and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America, which will be published by Cambridge University Press, studies the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states, demonstrating how ordinary democratic politics in unequal societies can both reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about rare moments of expansive reforms. Dr. Gonzalez received her PhD in politics and social policy from Princeton University. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, she was an assistant professor at the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Dr. Gonzalez has previously worked in human rights organizations in the US and Argentina, including the New York Civil Liberties Union, Andes, and Equipo Latinoamericano de Justicia y Género. As a reminder again, this event is being recorded and being streamed live on YouTube. We will run until about 2:30. The event will start with a conversation between the speakers and I. Beginning between 1:45 and 2 p.m., I will begin asking your questions to the speakers. So please privately text me your questions through the chat channel so that I can ask them at that time. So now, without further ado, I'd like to begin asking Doctors Bobia and Gonzalez questions, beginning our conversation about race and police violence in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'd like to start with Dr. Gonzalez. What can you tell me about the experience and the dynamics of police violence in South America?
Well, sure. First, I just want to thank everybody who's tuning in. I'm seeing the chat that folks are really tuning in from all over the place. So this is really nice. One nice thing about being in this Zoom, this virtual world we're all in now. So thanks to everyone. And thank you to Desmond for the invitation. I'm really excited to be able to be in conversation with you and Lilian on this really, just timely and important question. So I would begin by saying that police violence in South America, sort of as you noted, I'm going to focus most of my remarks on Brazil because that's one of the three countries that I study predominantly. Which my work focuses on a comparative analysis of Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia. But I'll sort of focus on Brazil because, of course, that is the most egregious case for the reasons that you mentioned. So I would say that starting with if we were thinking about an overview, I would characterize police violence in Latin America as distinctly authoritarian. So this is the argument, self-plug. This is the argument that I make in my book, which is that what we're seeing in terms of police violence in democracy today is not simply anti-democratic. It's not a failure of democracy. It's not. It's a distinctly authoritarian enclave that is reproduced by democratic processes, and I'm happy to talk about that, why I make that argument a bit later. But what I would say is that police violence displays three characteristics that we tend to typically see more commonly in authoritarian settings. So a lot of scholars of police in authoritarian countries, Sheena Greitens, work on China, Brian Taylor's work on Russia, and many other folks, Pablo Politer on Chile, the police forces that they describe, they actually look quite a bit like the police forces in many Latin American countries. So they are the three characteristics of the three criteria that I draw on based on these literatures are, the use of violence, use of coercion not being regulated by the rule of law, right? So that when we see police exercising violence, it's not because of the reasons that are typically quite tightly prescribed in the law and governed by principles of the rule of law. They are also not subjected to external accountability. We see very low rates of, we think accountability looks bad in the US in terms of police killings being investigated, police being brought to trial, convicted, etc. It's even worse in Latin America. One study in the 90s by Dan Brinks in Brazil, in Sao Paulo specifically, showed that only 6% of police killings ever resulted in a conviction. And I would say that those numbers are probably a lot less now. I'm currently conducting some analyses of that, but sort of my findings so far that the proportion is far less. So very, very little external accountability. And thirdly, often done in the interest of political done in the interest of political leaders. So rather than being focused on protecting citizens from crime, we often see the exercise of police violence and police aggression, police abuses, and just policing generally being carried out in the interest of political leaders rather than being driven by the need to protect citizens from crime. And I'm happy to give examples of that politicization of sort of seeing police resources being driven by in direct orders by where the governor says that they should be placed to provide for their supporters, rather than being sort of where is there more crime, where are we getting demands from the citizenry to place these police resources, just as a starting point. And so I would say that those three characteristics lead to levels of police violence that are sort of, as Desmond alluded to, are far higher than what people can conceive of in the United States. And these are always sort of difficult conversations because they say, oh, well, how do you compare, the 1,000 or so that are killed every year in the U.S. to the 4, 5, 6,000 in recent years in Brazil, right? So, but nevertheless, the magnitude is something that is far higher, and I would argue because of these characteristics of authoritarian policing that are far more prevalent. And I just wanted to note one additional vein of police violence that occurs particularly in Brazil, but is almost certain to be taking place in other parts of the region as well, which is killings happening through police-linked death squads. We often see such killings taking place, and they are necessarily are happening under the radar. So even these officially recorded figures that we know to be very high are actually an undercount when we consider massacres and other killings that are taking place with police involvement, but that are not being officially characterized as police killings. And again, I'm happy to flesh that out a bit further. But I'll sort of pause here just to have more of a conversation on that.
Great, thank you, Nilda. And Lillian, can you talk a bit about the dynamics of police violence in the Caribbean?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to Baruch College for this invitation and putting together this event, and you in particular, Desmond, for putting this event, making it possible and making it possible for me to share with Janilda and with you, and also welcoming all these people that are already connected today to this dialogue. Before I enter into the talking a little bit about the Caribbean, I wanted to comment on Janilda's emphasis on the authoritarianism. And actually, I just wrote a piece for the conversation that precisely make note about what is going on today here in the United States. And the protest, the manifestation are not only reflecting, on the police. In my view, also what people are precisely claiming it's against or challenging is precisely that that authoritarianism that I also agree that it's not only permeate the police, but also the justice system. And you could see that here also in the United States as, as these protests unfold, the more and more how people really feel like they are constrained in terms of the limitations of the rule of law and their participation. So I totally agree with Janelle, characterization of the role, the setting of authoritarianism, even in the context of these, emerging democracies in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the history of excessive and extralegal police use of force in the Caribbean reflect one of the most consistent patterns in the history of violence in that region. That history of violence absolutely connect those institutional ethos to their colonial pasts. And it continues to determine their performance in modern times through the social and economic and political evolution of these societies. Police violence is a daily and ubiquitous phenomenon for a particular sector of the population in the English and Spanish speaking Caribbean. For example, you mentioned, Desmond, previously in Jamaica, and you mentioned an important event that happened in 2010, and we are going to talk, I probably will go back to that, that happens in Tivoli Garden. Well, that happened also because there is one of the phenomenon that is going on in Latin America that actually, if you wanted to compare with the United States, we can see a little bit of that angle too, which is that that tendency to militarize the police and to become more and more militarized. Not only, I mean, when I'm talking about militarizing the police, what I'm saying is that they tend to work in countries like the Dominican Republic alone, in mixed troops with the military. So and they get reinforced by the military ethos also and mission. So this is one characteristic that we saw in particular in the case that you mentioned, Enrique, in the case of Tivoli Garden. In Jamaica, the annual estimate of people killed by the police is 200 a year, give or take. Amnesty International has documented that for the last 20 years, law enforcement had killed over 3,000 people, counting for 19% to 8% on the total homicide rate every year, okay? And in Trinidad and Tobago, only this year, 43 people, mostly Afro-Trinidadians, have died at the hands of the police. And those killings had been especially located in those areas in the northeastern part of the capital where African descendant tends to live, and has been reported as shootouts. These killings show a pattern of escalation of 60% or 80% from one year to another. In the Dominican Republic, my country, in the 12th last years, between, I would say, 2007 and 2019, 3,100 people have been killed by the police. And the number of killing in each administrations run between 200, 300 every year. So killing by the police sometimes represents 16% of all killings. In Puerto Rico, the war on drugs is still driving the incursions of the police, especially forces and military type, into either the enclosed residenciales or poor neighborhoods, but mostly where African descendant and Dominicans live. They conduct raids there, arrest young males. The Puerto Rican Police Department malpractices and abuse were exposed in the year, I think, 2011 or 2000 in an US Department of Justice report that accused a member of the police of being abusive and involved in illicit activities. So in general, the police do both in Puerto Rico. They neglect service to Black communities and over-police them. So in every case, widespread impunity reinforces a normalization process among sectors of the society against young Black men and impoverished community, as well as an internalized culture of complicity among different strata of the police institution that objectified through non-written codes used by the police, such as one shoot, one kill in Trinidad and Tobago, or give him a 29. or shootouts or legal killings in the Dominican Republic as a mechanism of deshumanize and justify the executions.
Mm-hmm. So Lillian, I wanted to follow up with that because you were already getting into the question directly of race and racism. I wanted you to talk in a little bit more detail about the impacts of race and racism on police violence, how that fits into those dynamics.
Sure. Thank you. Well, despite the fact that in the Caribbean, class and race and ethnicity and police vigilantism intersect each other, the correlation between those two last, meaning class and race and ethnicity, translate into another level of problematization, in my view. The function of the police as the enforcers of state coercion and control on one hand, and as a protector of social and political elites' privilege on the other, materialize daily in racial terms. I mean, the constant process of diminishing social citizenship. The way all this is interiorized is through a sort of smoke and mirrors, I will say, setting. In most of the Caribbean, there is a widespread idealized discourse of racial and ethnicity integration that celebrates diversity as a commodified attribute for tourism consumption and as an ideological, cultural, and identity mirage that captivates the popular imaginary while masking discriminatory profiling and the production of the criminal, transgressive, Black, and colored subjects. So for some scholars, the myth of the racial democracy represents the most blatant denial of racism among whites and people of colors in Caribbean nations. In a similar way that Michelle Alexander has challenged the presumed colorblind justice in the new Jim Crow system in the United States. And a good example of that is the fact that while Dominicans see themselves as not racists, big part of the population supported the sentence 16813 that was issued by the Constitutional Tribunal in 2013 that disenfranchised people born in the Dominican Republic from Haitian parents. As they become stateless, that decision put that population of almost 1 million in conflict with the law and under a category of subjects of surveillance and abuse by the police. So likewise, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, a study on the situation of African descendants in the Americas, identifies race and ethnicity as the most persistent and at the same time, a more subtle problem in the Caribbean and much more persistent in this region compared to other parts of the America. And I just wanted to finish this with an anecdote. When I was working for the development of the Democratic Security Plan in the Dominican Republic, and nobody in the discussion table brought the issue of race as one problem that we have to face. It was a non-issue at that time.
So I now wanted to turn this question over to Yanilda and ask her about sort of the racial dynamics of police violence in Latin America, in particular Brazil.
Yeah, thanks, Desmond, and thank you, Lillian, for that just really wonderful overview and characterization, I think, of the problem. I think what I would add, Lillian briefly brought up the question of citizenship. And the way that I think about policing and police presence in people's lives is precisely through the lens of citizenship. And this is something that I've written about and call stratified citizenship, sort of how police, which is sort of that your access to the rights of citizenship, which in democracy, ideally ought to be, equally available to everyone, are actually filtered through your race, your class, sort of where your spatial, sort of where your residential location, where you happen to live, and then a range of other social characteristics, right? And sort of the police is one of the key institutions of the state that does this filtering, that does this sort of division of whether in determining whether you're actually going to have access to the full rights of citizenship or not. And so it's no surprise then that we see police violence consistently showing similar disparities along lines of race and class and space and geography, residential location that we see in so many other aspects of life. And so, as I said, I'm going to focus primarily on Brazil, but I think it's also important to note that it's easy to focus on Brazil because it's sort of where we have the most complete statistics. I think it's also important to sort of think about where don't we know about and why not? Because I think two very prominent cases that have recently come out in Colombia, specifically in the city of Puerto Tejada, two young men, Anderson Arboleda and Janet Garcia, two young Black men in their 20s, killed by police in the context of a global pandemic, right? As police are supposedly going out enforcing, quarantine orders and curfews, supposedly to save lives, police are also contributing to considerable amounts of Black death in these contexts. And so I think it's also important to think about that. So thinking about specifically Brazil, sort of Desmond, you mentioned the fact that of the many thousands of killings that we see in Brazil. We know that at the national level, 75% of those killed by police in Brazil are Black. And that's in comparison with about just over half of the population of the country. In the case of Sao Paulo, which is the state that I study, we see an even starker disparity, right? So Black Paulistas are just over 1/3 of the population of the state, but they constitute almost 2/3 of the victims. And this is compounded by levels of education, sort of concentrated in the southern, in the peripheries of the city, so the southern, eastern, northern zones of the city, and they tend to display this racial disparity. But one thing that I wanted to note in this conversation, in addition to just the numbers and the stark disparities, is that this is something that is broadly known in society, right? So it's something that when we think about citizenship, this is not something where people can say, oh, well, we didn't know, we're just finding out, right? Which is something that we often see in the US of like, oh, a lot of white Americans are suddenly waking up. In Brazil, people are awake. People know that these disparities exist. And the question, I think, that to be raised is sort of, why is it more being done? So I'll just give you a couple of examples of sort of the broad knowledge that police do not treat everyone equally, and that inequality is marked by things like race, class, and geography, right? So in 2017, when the new commander of the Rota, which is one of the supposed tactical elite units of the São Paulo military police, when he began, he did an interview wherein he sort of drew a lot of attention, because he said, when you're stopping somebody, you can't stop a citizen in the neighborhood, the well-to-do, mostly white neighborhood of Jardins, the way that you would stop them in the periferias, right? The mostly Black, mostly poor peripheries of the city. Right, and so this is something that drew a lot of attention, but largely because it seemed to be, you sort of said what you were not supposed to say, sort of something that had remained outspoken, but broadly known. And sort of more recently, we've seen a juxtaposition of videos in Sao Paulo of police being humiliated by residents in, white residents in well-to-do areas of the city, who specifically, are talking to sort of police, the rank and file police, who tend to come from these same areas, who are, themselves Black or Afro-descendant, lower income, and from the peripheries, being told, kind of, pardon my French, sort of, you ain't shit here, you're in, this part, you may be, you may be hot shit in the periphery, but here you're nothing, you're trash. And those videos have been juxtaposed with police, violent police abuses in the peripheries, including in the same day of sort of, as a woman, white woman was humiliating police for trying to give her a ticket. The police were also shown beating up women in the peripheries and spraying pepper spray into a home, despite being told that a child with disabilities was in the home. Right, so I think that kind of, class, racialized, and discriminatory policing, these are things that are broadly out there. They're broadly known. Sort of, these are things that everybody knows. And so the question becomes, when people say the very common phrase in Brazil, "Bandido bom é bandido morto," a good criminal is a dead criminal. We know that it's no secret to anybody that those deaths are disproportionately affecting one part of the population. And so why is it that this broadly known phenomenon is not really being acted upon more. I mean, and I have some answers, but the question I think for many of us is sort of, this is not happening because people don't know about it. It's something that is as evident to police and those who are leading police as it is evident to those who are very privileged in society and who most of their lives are rather shielded and insulated from police violence. So I would sort of leave that question open for discussion.
So for my next question, and I'm going to put this back to you, Yanilda, what's the history of this? Where does this particular experience of knowing and accepting this comes from? How is contemporary police violence embedded in local histories of slavery, segregation, and particularly in the Caribbean of colonialism?
Yeah, well, I'll speak again sort of from the Brazilian example, because I think that for those folks who are joining in from the US, there will be a lot of parallels. Sort of as elsewhere throughout the world, right, the creation of police emerged from a desire by those in power to remain in power and to maintain a particular social order. So when you have, slave societies, the earliest manifestations of police forces were those that were there to enforce slavery, and that's something that we see in the development of sort of the earliest forms of police forces in Brazil in the 19th century. And again, I just sort of want to, of course, I acknowledge that I'm not a historian, so this is not the sort of the main area of my research, but I think it's something that is impossible to ignore the historical parallels. The commander that I mentioned earlier of the Rota, right? We could see him speaking, 200 years ago, similarly, right? Saying, well, you can't treat, the slave owner the way that you would treat, the enslaved person, right? And so I think that that those historical racialized class patterns are things that we still see to this day. And I think that much like the US, it emerges from a lack of work done in society to come to terms with those histories and those legacies. And in the case of Brazil, we could also add, the legacies of military dictatorships and how police violence was a tool for keeping the regime in power then as well. And so I think that again, so much of my argument is very much grounded in the present about how everyday contestation today reinforces these patterns of police violence, which I alluded to in my previous comments. But we can't neglect that these historical legacies and these patterns of how different groups in society understand policing absolutely come from these earlier racialized legacies, right? That police are still there to reinforce those same racialized and classed power structures.
And so I wanted to put this question to you also, Lillian. How does the history of colonialism, slavery, and inequality in the Caribbean affect the dynamics of police violence?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that probably more than in any other region of Latin America, the Caribbean history of slavery translates into contemporary predicaments as African descendants face police persecution and coercion while being the most victimized by crime at the national, intra, and extra regional level. And we need to remember that these societies, as it happened also with Brazil, incorporate as a peripheral society into the core world economy, precisely with a very violent through a very violent process of colonization, and that the construction, the building of constabulary force at that time were crucial for for continuing the process of colonization that was preceded even by incorporating slaves as also, even the slaves as also, the ones that have to follow and not only follow the laws, but also the laws of the colonizer, but also to be part of the process of surveillance. So in the national arenas, Caribbean police, in some cases, those constabularies still remains. That type of conformation it exists in the Caribbean, and they are effective guardians of the racial distinctiveness. By embracing the role, they become the instrumental actor of the recreation of the colonization past and on the accommodation of power and redistribution of wealth in multiracial societies. So the police agency is the one that frames multiracialism in a constraining mode in the Caribbean, I will say, even though most low-ranks police comes from a poor Afro-descendant background. So the question, as Janilda posited before, the question arises how to explain intra-racial coercion in multiracial and multi-ethnic communities, from where even those that practice institutional violence belongs to. So to me, one explanation is that through its discretionary power and the exercise of its relative autonomy, the police became the enabler of a normalized process of exclusion, inclusion, and as a qualifier of who belongs and who is going to be protected in a society. By factoring identity and by assuring that those that do not qualify for upper mobility will be kept at the bottom of the social stratification system. And in this process, the justice and political system reinforce those patterns. That means that as much as police brutality is ingrained within the institutional subculture, it does reflect the embedded racial codes of segregation and stigmatization based on the color of the skin that manifests as racism, and as it's also found within the indentured servitude and slavery mode of production. Which they tend to reproduce as part of the institutional ethos and practice. For example, by practicing selective coercion, Dominican police agents distance themselves from individuals that are Afro-descendant. They try to fulfill the widening process of themselves by echoing the narrative that we are not them, and by assimilating Haitians to the only blacks in the country, the suspected criminal. Now, inequality is a factor that potentializes racial discrimination. The available data shows that in countries like Jamaica, police intervention concentrates in those neighborhoods of the West Kingston and Clarendon where African descendants are poor resides. Likewise, in Trinidad and Tobago, those that tend to be more politicized, even among the poorest, are among the poorest and disadvantaged population are the darkest one. Despite that, Afro-descendant Trinidadian made up for 78 of the victims of crime and homicide, according to studies. So in my country, interviews that I and others had realized with several light-skinned young gangs members from poor neighborhoods, they revealed that they never had experienced arrests, contrary to most of young Black males in the same locations. Now, as I mentioned before, discriminatory policing transcends the national and local sphere as Black population became expanded subjects of racial surveillance in other countries following the colonial link. In these countries, race is a very fluid subject. In the Dominican Republic, Haitians are treated as a Black and non-citizen, brutalized by the police without the complaint of most part of the society. While in Puerto Rico, Dominicans are also treated as Black and non-citizens. They are segregated in poor neighborhoods. Many of them have been victims of police brutality because of their legal status and racial and ethnic profile. in contrast with the racial profile of many poor Puerto Ricans that see themselves as predominantly white. 80% of them actually say that they were white according to the census of 2010. So one activist asserted that for the police, there are no Black men here. If you are Black, it's because you are a Dominican. And some scholars pointed out that police in Dominican is a way that Puerto Ricans displace the racial discomfort. So millions of Caribbean people live in the diaspora where the racial differences pursue them. In Great Britain, for example, since the time of post-colonization in the 1960s, regulation and control have been, in fact, the trade-off arrangement that diasporas from the Commonwealth Caribbean has to accept in order to be integrated into Britain. Non-conformity to comply is regulated by compulsory deportation, and which means that those Caribbean immigrants were already perceived as a source of conflict by the state and segments of the population, and they will continue to be subject to surveillance and control as part of the ideal of assimilation. So this is, as you see, we can see a broader phenomena that even transcend, but still link it to that past of colonization for those Caribbean communities and societies.
Okay, great. So my next question is how is society seeking to respond to these problems? How are the responses in Latin America and the Caribbean similar to or different from the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States? Why don't we start with Yanilda this
time? Sure. I mean, I think much as has been happening around the U.S., as has been happening, the marches that we've seen as well happening around Europe and other parts of the world. Latin America has been no exception in seeing in recent months, in recent weeks, mass protests against police violence. But of course, these protests, much like here, this mobilization, these protests, this organizing is not new in the region, right? I mean, it's interesting, like a lot of sort of media articles, even in Latin America, that were talking about, you would see like Black Lives Matter comes to Colombia, or, sort of Black Lives Matter in Brazil, as though these movements don't have, very long histories in those countries as well. So I think it's important to know that the people have long been organizing. Black people in Brazil, in Colombia, elsewhere, have been organizing against police violence for quite some time. And so the recent cases, as I mentioned, Anderson Arboleda, Janer Garcia, João Pedro in Rio, Guilherme Guedes in Sao Paulo, these are all recent killings that have happened at the hands of police, and that led to mobilizations calling for an end to police violence and an end to racial discrimination. And so I think that that's a really important thing that we have to highlight, is that, these are movements where people have been organizing for a very long time, in addition to responding to specific cases today. I think that one really important difference, and I think it's perhaps the most significant one from the perspective of what is possible in terms of what changes are possible right now, is that what we're seeing in the US, we're really seeing a singular moment in history where we're seeing protests across all 50 states. We're seeing multiracial protests, and we're in some places we're seeing protests where the vast majority of people are white. We're seeing public opinion surveys showing 70% of people supporting the protests. For the first time, majorities or near majorities of white people saying that police treat Black people differently. We're seeing a kind of what I call in my book a sort of a convergence of societal demands around policing in the U.S., whereas in Latin America we're seeing the continuation of fragmentation of societal demands around policing. We're still seeing sort of class-based, race-based, et cetera, differences in the types of demands that people are making from police. And so we're still seeing the same sectors of society that have always been critical of police, that have always been organizing around police violence, that have always suffered police violence, largely being on their own and demanding change. And so we're not seeing the sort of large scale protests that we've been seeing in the US. And I think that that's the kind of most unfortunate difference in terms of seeing the possibility the possibility for change. And one thing that we might want to flag and point out to, for example, is the other sort of pro-democracy protests that have been happening in Brazil in conjunction sort of with the coronavirus pandemic. And so one possibility is if those two, sort of ultimately pro-democratic movements were to join together, if the sort of pro-democracy protests sort of would also take authoritarian policing as something that they are opposing, we might see something different emerge. But I would sort of flag that as a key difference, and I think probably the key indicator of what's going to happen after this.
Okay.
Probably not very much.
So before I turn this question over to Lillian, I just wanted to remind all of our guests today to, if they have questions, post them to me in a private chat message. So please do that. I'm going to start asking those questions relatively soon. So Lillian, what can you say about social responses to
I
police
think
violence?
that the wave of protests against police brutality and racial discrimination after the killing of George Floyd resonates within Caribbean societies among a growing sector of politically active youth that for some years had been critically examining through the social media the construction of identity in their countries and embracing their Blackness. These manifestations had been giving voice to those that are the daily recipients of repression and persecution. They realize that this is an opportunity for many to awake from neglect and denial. And I've seen those through just looking at you just look at the newspapers and the protests and how the protests had been repressed by the police, particularly because they are trying to focus on the racial thing and the need to embrace that identity, Afrontilian identity. But I also wanted to emphasize that the Caribbean societies have a long tradition of collective resistance and protect based on consistent work of grassroots organizations. Disadvantaged sectors and middle class, even middle class in the Dominican Republic, mobilize and take the streets to demand for the increasing of the education budget, to protest against corruption, for the environment, and against police abuse. In Puerto Rico also, there is a long and well-documented history of collective action carried out by decades of demanding fair distribution of public land, but also against police brutality. When I was researching in the community in San Juan, in several of the communities in San Juan, I saw the work of organizations, churches, and local leaderships working together with young gangs, the issue of violence and intra-community conflict in order to minimize the presence of police in their communities precisely. So there are not only, in Loíza, for example, which is one important part of Puerto Rico that it's where most of a very big percentage of African descendant population live, and with some history of violence among young groups, the Fuerzas de Choque, as the police is called. It's as I mentioned, a militarized kind of type of SWAT type of police. They used to move into communities and seal them up. However, since 2012, actually at the time that I ended up my research there had been in Loíza implementing a project similar to the one that was created here in Boston, the ceasefire, and that has repercussion in other places in the United States with the violent interrupters, that actually they are looking at those alternatives as a way to say to the police, you don't have to come and invade our territories. We can deal with the violence here. And so I think this is a very interesting way to deal with. So there is, in one hand, the recognition of the complexity embedded into the racial issues on the Caribbean, which include intra-ethnic conflicts between African and Indian descendants in Trinidad, and between Haitian and Dominicans in the Dominican Republic that were promoted during colonial times and still manifested themselves politically. But there is also the recognition of the commonality and meta-crisis, as a Trinitarian attorney put it, of systemic oppression, structural violence, economic, social, and physical violence that is perpetrated through global economic system that operates to reward accumulation of power. So I think that people had been fighting more and more in the Caribbean for visibility. And when I talk about people, it's particularly those that are the darkest one, the Afro-descendant ones, the poorest one, the more marginalized and vulnerable ones, LGBTQ communities, that they had been fighting for visibility, for against injustice at all levels. And they are also looking about the racial disparities and fighting for the needs to be more visible, even for the justice records. So I think that when I started actually for a long time living here in the United States, every time that I saw issues in the TV, I was saying, why people do not take the streets like in the Caribbean? You know, that's a way that people deal with through protest, because there are not so many mediations like here in the United States. People just take the street and fight the state. So we have in the Caribbean a long experience, and that experience in some way, I think, also stimulate what happens here through the diasporas, as I mentioned, but also it's a give and take. I think that there have been also lessons learned from here that could be translated to the Caribbean, as the case of Loíza in Puerto Rico has shown.
Mm-hmm. So one of our audience members, Katie Sullivan, asks, "What about police violence in Cuba, Lillian? What can you tell us about police violence and race in Cuba?"
Well, that's a good question, and as that person will know, there is not much information for many reasons. It's very difficult to do research in Cuba. It's very difficult even for people that have been working on issues on military presence and control in Cuba. That doesn't mean that in Cuba do not exist issues of control by the police. And here again, we need to understand that the Cuban, has a very particular reality, very different even in the constitution of the security forces, because the FARC, the military, the FARC, the Fuerzas Revolucionarias in Cuba, they are the ones that control even the defense, the national interest, and also the local control, exert the local control too. So what I know is that it's very common that it's not uncommon that one police or one military had the uniform of the FARC, the Fuerzas Revolucionarias, and then they shift to the uniform of the police. So there is a continuity there, and it's a society that it's very permeated from the top to bottom by the security, by the national security. So the national interest in some way, the political elites had overlap with the internal control as it is. And so there is repression, and there is repression. The issue of the racial issue, the race issue in Cuba, it had been also a very challenging and problematic issue. Even I mean, obviously before the revolution, during the revolution, and it's still it is. I mean, still for a long time, African-American descendants in Cuba, which is a very important population, and even though they participate also on the revolution, they had been also marginalized from positions, from political positions, and there had been a lot of pressure from African descendants in Cuba to gain a more active space on the political decision, which basically, as we know, it's it's fundamental in order to change laws and to change also at least official and institutionalized arrangements. So police, the issues like drug consumption and drug that among young and disturbance or protests that had happened in Cuba, of course, that had been controlled by the police and by the FARC in Cuba. Absolutely. The Cuba in that sense is not different from our police, that police the puntos de drogas, the point of selling drugs in the barrios, in the community. So that happens in Cuba too, absolutely.
So Roberta Kilkenny asks, given that the English-speaking Caribbean police force is organized nationally, would decentralization help in making the police more responsive? I want to expand this question a bit and ask you both, beginning with Yanilda, what types of reforms, including decentralization, but other approaches, do you think are important to responding to police, race-based police violence in Latin America and the Caribbean? So Yanilda.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I think it's been really fascinating to follow the chat on the side and seeing, you know, the different reform measures that people have been talking about. And so one of which is, which has come up quite a bit is, for example, body cameras, which has become the kind of go-to thing, implicit bias training, you know, community policing. These are the kind of old standbys of reform in the US, particularly since Ferguson, but of course they have a much larger legacy, and they have a longer history in Latin America as well. But we kind of see this continue to be the kinds of policies that governments want to rely on. So for example, last week, the governor of Sao Paulo announced in response to outrage over those videos and other police abuses that I mentioned, was, okay, we're going to go and retrain every single police officer, as though they don't know that they can't beat people up, and we're going to place body cameras we're going to use body worn cameras as well. We're going to roll that out throughout the police force. And so we see that this has continued to be the go-to response. These are types of responses that I characterize as operational, that ultimately change police practices, particularly outwardly, but don't do very much to change police structures, that don't very much change structures of power, and that don't meaningfully open up the police to external accountability, which, as I mentioned earlier, is important for democratic policing. And so I think that one of the things that we need to do is think about how, you know, sort of what are the underpinnings of the police's structural power, which is something that I write about. Sort of what is it that enables them to have so much of a massive role in society, and that allows them to gain concessions from politicians, so that rather than demilitarizing or decentralizing the police, the thing that they go to is body cameras, right? And so I think that one of the things that we need to do is sort of think bigger and think and develop more of an imagination about the types of reforms that are necessary, right? So, and we kind of have been, there's been some backward movement on this over time, because in the 1990s, the reforms that I study in Colombia and in Argentina, and the ones that were being debated in Brazil, but were not ultimately passed, people were thinking very ambitiously and very deeply about police reforms, right? So people enacted very important measures of decentralization, demilitarization, of completely overhauling internal and external oversight measures. And again, just thinking about, like, people dissolved police forces entirely, right? There was just all kinds of ways that people were thinking about this much more deeply. Even in Brazil in 2013, when we saw those massive protests and that resulted in large scale police violence, people were thinking a lot about, like, we have to demilitarize the police, we have to dissolve the military police. People were thinking much more broadly. And now we've come to a point where the things that people are talking about are things like trainings and body worn cameras, right? And so I think that we know that these things are not going to change the fundamental structures of power in society or in policing. And so I think that just to sort of have you know, I think one of the good things that we're seeing in the US, and I don't know if ultimately this view will win out, but it's striking to see it because it looks much more like old school Latin American debates about police reform, is this defund movement, right? Because people are saying you need to constrain the power that police and the role that police has in society if you want to fundamentally change these violent practices. And so I think that that taking that principle to heart, to sort of making it less likely that police will even be in a position to go to be so ever present in poor communities, to be, you know, rather than other state entities that we might want, like school and, you know, education, health, and other types of services, I think would be going in the right direction. Because I think what my research shows is that you give police more of a role in society, you give police more power, you're going to end up with more of these disparities and far less sort of social and political consensus around undoing it. And so I'll stop there just to have Lilian chime in.
Okay, Lilian.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think thinking also on what Yanila just say, I think scholars and citizens and policymakers in the Caribbean have pretty much exhausted their expectation for cosmetics police reform. Okay, we have seen more, for example, you know, the premature enthusiasm with the use of body cameras, as Yanilda mentioned, or internal investigation units that tend to overvalidate by authorities and criminologists as mechanisms of transparency, when in fact their implementation did not necessarily translate into behavioral and agency change. And sometimes the reluctance to change rather appears as an accommodation strategy, like a body that create their own antivirus, no? Yet we are now facing a demand for real transformation. As Yanilda mentioned, I mean, there are places like here, I haven't seen that in the Caribbean, but here about the abolition, which sometimes I think it's interesting to put the things on that level of, you know, the extreme on the continuum, just to try the different considerations and the different possibilities. No, probably we need to think more about out of the box. One of the things that we haven't learned is the capacity of Caribbean police agents to resist and undermine changes. The resilience comes from the prerogative given by police elites to capitalize power, influence, and benefits. Their negotiation capacity always involves a trade-off between concessions and prerogative, no? So more and so in the midst of clientelist political cultures. So states tend to foment the creation of favorable structures of opportunity for the police to privately benefit from either on regular arrangement like moonlighting, or by, you know, just turning the head when they know that police is very involved in criminal activities. So that's why most of the attempt to reform the police comes either from scandals or from crisis of legitimation or before elections. And they are usually co-opted or resistant from the start. So I agree with what Janila just mentioned before, that for the most crucial, for me, the most crucial area to cover in terms of transformation of policing has to do with the ability and accountability. And these two areas are the most problematic ones to get police institutions on board, especially with unionized bodies. They resist this restriction to their immunity under the allegation of the risk involved and the nature of their job. And it is undeniable that their jobs does involve daily personal risk. However, that doesn't mean that they should be given de facto immunity every time they trample individual constitutional and human rights, as it occurs with any other professional areas. No, I used to tell my students. I mean, one thing that I must say is that I'm at Fishburne, we have a special program that trains cadets police. And I think this is they have to take up 4 years. 4 years is a 4 year program where they learn everything about the criminal justice system. I think this type of training. It's important, but I'm talking about long training where they are exposed, and this is a mix. We have a mix of students. This is they are exposed to other views. And not only they are exposed to all other views in their process of formation, but also they are contested all the time about, you know, all these things that are happening, including the ethics part. So I think that, as I tell my students, you know, accountability is fundamental for the effective and efficient performance of the police function. For one thing, the police cannot count on citizens' collaboration and fomenting mistrust at the same time. So I think there should be external effective scrutiny. In Jamaica, after many attempts and official commitments to address unlawful killing, torture, and malpractice, like in the Hearst report that came up in the 90s, finally there is an independent commission of investigation that it's not depend, even though it was created by the Congress. It's independent and was created in 2010. And as a result of that, they had already investigating around 22 cases and prosecuted several of them. They had just convicted one officer at this point, but they find out that, for example, in one case, 24% of killings had been done by just one officer. And that most of the killings are concentrated between 300 and 400 officers. So in synthesis, police reform can't operate in a vacuum. We must realize that in these multicultural societies, policing people of colors continues and is not recognized as a distinctive issue in the legal system of punitive governance, okay? So in the Dominican Republic, the denial of these translate in a lack of anti-discrimination legislation, especially regarding the use of force by the police or the unfairness of the delivering of justice. So this is continue to be an explicit non-issue. And I think that has to change. In other words, I think that reforming the police cannot be seen as an isolated process. It has to be part of really a strategy, a broader strategy that requires to look at the complete justice system also too.
So I wanted to follow up now with a question from Tiana Ruiz, who asks, what would abolition look like in Latin America? And the interesting thing is that in Latin America, we've actually seen a great deal of abolition, as I think Yanilda might have been mentioning earlier. So the Venezuelans abolished the police force in the last decade or so and replaced it with a new police force. The Mexicans have, I believe, abolished the police force and replaced it. The Brazilians restructured their police forces at different moments during the authoritarian period and democratization. In my experience, looking at Latin America, the abolition of police forces and the replacement with new police forces seems to reproduce a lot of the same problems as before, if not creating new ones, depending on the nature of the new force. I was wondering if you guys might want to reflect a little bit more, and perhaps briefly, on your knowledge about abolition and the reconstruction of police forces in the region.
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really, goes to the point that I was making earlier about sort of sort of ambitious thinking about what is needed to actually address these structural questions of police violence and abuses and all other sorts of deficiencies with those institutions. Which is that, sort of when you think about the civil war ending in El Salvador, Guatemala, like the existing police forces were abolished, and replaced with new police forces. In Buenos Aires province, a really ambitious police reform there, the sort of pre-existing Policía Bonaerense was abolished and it was replaced, the sort of the figure of police chief ceased to exist. And instead, these sort of smaller, 18 smaller regional departments that wouldn't have the same political power of a singular police chief were created. So we have lots of examples of police forces of being abolished, but I think much like as Desmond said, and as I think is in the spirit perhaps of the abolitionist movement that we've been seeing in the US and spreading elsewhere, that it's not simply about abolishing a police force and replacing it with another police force, right? Because we've seen many, the Venezuelan case is one, that the Metropolitan Police of Caracas being abolished and replaced with, other much more violent, somehow they managed to be even more violent than the previous police force. And so I think that what people are really battling for here is for, as I was suggesting, sort of diminishing the role of police in society altogether, eventually to the point of not being necessary. But I think that one of the things that we've been seeing is sort of the opposite. Sort of police, one thing that I've observed in my field work, particularly in Sao Paulo, is where police are taking on many more roles in communities, right? So I would see police, community police stations being libraries, where people, they were the ones that were distributing food baskets. They would have a telecentro, sort of a computer center. They would be running youth soccer teams. And sort of taking on all these other, I would see other entities of the state. So like the State Secretariat of Labor and other entities of the state sort of going through the police station to reach residents, right? Sort of setting up camp to sign up for jobs in the police station, right? In communities that are heavily policed, heavily criminalized, et cetera, right? Sort of how many people are going to feel comfortable going and signing up for jobs in the police station, right? In addition to sort of policing in schools and ever expanding footprint in these communities. And so I think that what people are saying is to sort of have a minimal police role in the way that you see in well-to-do communities, right? Where you rarely see police cars patrolling, where you rarely see police, stopping people and putting them up against the wall, and stop and frisk and committing all other types of abuses, so that people are pushing for abolition in a way that constructs safety primarily not through security forces, not through policing. And so I think that we've seen exactly the opposite in many low-income communities and marginalized and racialized communities in Latin America. And to your earlier point, Desmond, I think you might have said this before we were streaming, is that we've seen different forms of abolition, which is, locally constituted, non-state armed groups, gangs and others actually being the ones that exercise police power in a lot of communities, often leading to other types of abuses, right? Probably because of similar reasons of lack of accountability and everything else. And so I think we also, when we think about abolition, we have to think about sort of how do we construct safety and security in the absence of armed actors, whether we call them police or something else.
Okay, great. Lillian, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very challenging question. For one thing, first we need to recognize that in Latin America and in the Caribbean for sure, there had been already de facto kind of abolition of the funding of the police, the public police. By the tendency to privatize the security. I mean, let me give you just an example. In most of the Caribbean, I went to a conference organized by CARICOM about, the emerging but growing exponentially sector of private security, and how they were trying to, think about how they regulated them and whatever. In the Dominican Republic, there are the amount of private security is exactly the same amount that public security. They have 35,000 agents while the Dominican police is 38,000. So there is an over security there, a process of securitization really of the whole society. And then you have also, you know, the pressure of these, you know, the societies that, as Janilda had explained elsewhere, of societies that are do not have a real clear consensus about how the things are going. But obviously, people that have resources, middle class, high class, they had found a solution of deficient and you know, inefficient public police. So when we are talking about abolishing the police, we are talking about really about the need to a change of a whole paradigm that, of course, had been based also in that myth of, you know, that the police really is protecting everybody. And I agree with the last point that Janela just mentioned, and I wanted to go back to my example on Loíza, how they are precisely, and not only Loíza. When I went to when I work in Puerto Rico in Barrio Obrero, for example, there were communities. The communities were already negotiating. You know, conflicted spaces with you know, with groups, with gang groups and pandillas. They had been the communities, mostly organized communities, had been able to resolve their internal problems and basically minimize or mediate conflicts through with the gangs members or cabecillas. And so that process, those processes of self-regulation, I think are occurring in many places, many local and many, you know, small places. So the idea is, if it's possible, to think about a model that could be could reproduce multiple times and resolve the issues precisely on those areas where police tend to be more brutal and more corrupted too. And again, the main problem here is, you know, we need to shift. We need to bring that discussion to the political arena, because it's a pressure that comes from political elites, governmental bureaucracies, and of course part of the society that already have their security assured by paying for it. And so I think that it's not impossible to think, and the problem is that when we talk about abolition, I would rather think about or put it in terms of, we need to change the paradigm. We need to change the paradigm that relies on this type of policing that we had until now. And that implies, of course, looking for other alternatives that, you know, that implies self-regulation, that implies, you know, the incorporation of new actors, the decriminalization of subjects that had been criminalized, even the concept of crime, which we know, we as a social scientist know that is a social, cultural, and historical concept, the construction of crime. So we need to go through that in order to really think about that, you know, the paradigm that we have now with the type of the police is not working. It never had worked, and it will continue to creating problems. And so that's what I think. When you know, when people hear it's talking about abolition, and there are examples here even in Massachusetts of police that had been abolished. I think that we need to think on those terms. We cannot think on terms of, we are going to abolish these police and then we are going to bring a new one, because that we tried that before, and what happened is that there is a you know, dragging of, you know, some institutional cultures that can recreate themselves again. So it is, to me, it's a total shift of paradigm, but it's possible. I think it is possible.
So to bring this to sort of broaden this question, and also to bring it back to the question of to connect it a little bit more strongly to the question of race and police violence in the United States. Latin America has undergone a lot of protests and, as you guys have mentioned, police reform, efforts at police reform over the past generation. What can people who are interested in reforming the police in the United States learn from the experience in Latin America and the Caribbean? Lillian?
Okay, I think that I think that there is a lot to learn. As I mentioned before, collective action, had been a major factor in building society and building collectivity in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And I think I mentioned before also the role of the diaspora, and how, for example, the media had played an important role in those countries, and actually sharing experience. So I think that conversation between, I mean, like what can we learn from you and vice versa, had already started through those, those social media and those connections to the diaspora, despite of the COVID-19 and despite of the closing of borders. And I think there had been an inspirational awakening, in part channelized through those diasporas and through those conversations. I can say much about the tactical aspects of exchangeability, but if we think in the examples that we have about, for example, transnational process, such as, drug markets and police policies that spill over across border, I don't see why we cannot reflect and think about dissemination through grassroots movement, through academia, especially with issues that are, challenging the authoritarianism that we talk about and the abuse of power, as well as the lack of tolerance. So I think that the experience that we have seen here, for example, in United States with, the civil rights movement, what we have seen is that there had been a lot of learning in this country among African Americans that could be translated to Latin America and the Caribbean and vice versa. And it's true that a lot of that have been gained through the civil rights movement, had been undone in many ways. But there had been also an accumulation process, an accumulative process, and what is going on today, it's precisely, to me, part of that, continuity within those process of discontinuity. Okay, so there had been those things. It's exactly the same in the Caribbean. There are no know-hows that had been translated from one community to another community, and I think that spirit, that is what we need to learn. That's what we have to. That capacity of resilience is the one that we have to learn, and to start exchanging and strengthening those channels of communication between, the experience here, local experience here, and in the Dominican Republic and Trinidad and Tobago and Cuba, even Cuba.
Yanilda?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of lessons to be had, and I might distill them into a handful. I'll try to limit myself to 2 or 3. But so I think that the first one of them needs to be to think about sort of who has access to the benefit, who sort of has access to the benefits of police reform. And I would just give the example of, for example, of the Colombian National Police Force, which, if we were to look at it in the 80s or early 90s, before it underwent a reform process, it was sort of a generalized, violent, corrupt police force that sort of everyone in Colombian society had experienced as such. But what we've seen in recent decades since the reform in the early 90s and mid 90s were passed is that the continuing abuses have been concentrated among sort of poor and racialized communities in the way that we would sort of recognize in the United States. And so the kind of broader crisis of policing that people spoke of back in that era is not being talked about as such, even though for some communities that crisis never ended. And so I think that being able to, so today the Colombian police is seen as this regional leader and celebrated, and sort of if we were to look at the numbers, of course, police killings have declined considerably in Colombia when we were to compare, if we were to compare it to the 80s and 90s, but sort of that violence and those abuses continue to be concentrated in poor, racialized, sort of Black communities in the large urban centers. And so I think that we ought to always ask that question of sort of who is this reform for, and who is ultimately going to see the benefits of any improvements that we see in policing. I think the second lesson that we ought to keep in mind, and I think it is a related one, is to see the limits of these operational reforms that I was referencing earlier. So as police may become more professionalized, they may become more teched up, they may be better trained, they may have access to sort of other types of operational improvements, but that many abuses are still very likely to continue for the reasons that I've mentioned. And so here, the Sao Paulo police is one that comes to mind. So today, again, it's a regional leader. It's other police forces in Brazil send their police officers to the police academy in Brazil in Sao Paulo to be trained. But at the same time, this is a highly deadly police force where sort of in the last few years, police in the state of Sao Paulo have been responsible for a quarter to a third of all, for the equivalent of a third of all homicides in the state. And actually recent news reporting shown that police killings to date in 2020 actually outnumber other types of homicides, other types of intentional homicides, right? And so I think it's really important to beware. So this is, I would say far more professionalized, technology that rivals many U.S. police forces, and that is seen as a regional leader in large part due to these operational and professionalizing reforms that they implemented beginning about 2 decades ago. But that the levels of abuses that we've seen by the Sao Paulo police force, the sort of high lethality of its police force, continue to this day. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, right, 2/3 of those that are killed are Black and belong to the what people in Sao Paulo call the 3Ps, preto, pobre, da periferia, right, Black, poor, and from the periphery. And so I think that again, these questions is that we have to beware of what can and cannot be done through these operational reforms. And I would say the third point is to beware also of what police will do to undo reforms. And so this is something that Lilian talked about earlier. And so one thing that we know from the very transformative police reforms that I study and that others study in Latin America is that very quickly after they're enacted, you may see very transformative legislation passed in the legislature and governors and presidents and everyone getting behind it. But almost as soon as before the ink is dry, police are already getting to work in undoing that. And I argue in various things that I've written that a lot of that has to do with a sort of a loss of that political and social consensus that enabled the reform to happen in the first place. And so the sustainability of that consensus in the long term is the key question here, because if it returns to the the previous fragmentation of societal preferences and demands about policing, we're going to see the police exert their power as they had before, seeking to undo those hard-fought reforms.
Okay, well, I wanted to thank Lilian and Yanilda for their contributions today. This was a great conversation. I wanted to thank everybody else for participating and for offering questions. We couldn't unfortunately get to all of the questions. There were a lot of really great questions, but time is of course limited. In the chat stream, you will see a message at 2:16 from Andrea Hundley about where the recording of the panel can be viewed on YouTube. So there's a link there for anybody who wants to find that. So that's there. The last thing I wanted to mention is that coming up later this month and next month, the upcoming Global Insights series are associated with COVID responses in different parts of the world. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. And so again, thanks to everybody and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you, Desmond, and good to see you. And thank you, Yanila.
Yeah, good to see you too, Lina. Good to see you both.